Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. It's the fourth commandment and the topic of this session. Despite the fact that a lot of people these days think this one is a no-brainer, which is to say they think it's perfectly self-explanatory, if of course they pay any attention to it at all. But the truth is it's really a lot more complicated and a lot more convicting than we give it credit for being. And I found out that myself as I was preparing for this. I thought it would be a lot easier to do, but it's quite complicated. But an example of this is the fact that people can't even agree what day the Lord is speaking of when he spoke those words. What day did he mean? What day is the Sabbath day? For instance, an absolutely literal understanding of this passage, beginning in Exodus 20, verse 11, "For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested the seventh day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it." It teaches us that the Sabbath is a reference to the seventh day of the week, Saturday, right? Well, technically, this is the way the Jews understand this passage, although in Judaism, the Sabbath actually begins at sundown on Friday night and continues until sundown on Saturday night. But all of Saturday proper, the day, is still the Sabbath. In Christianity, there are a number of Christian denominations, the largest of which is the 19 million member, very appropriately named Seventh-day Adventist Church, who continue to observe Saturday as the Sabbath day because they believe the church was in error when it transferred the Sabbath from Saturday to Sunday. Another group who keep Saturday Sabbath are the people known as Messianic Jews, who retain the customs of Judaism while accepting that Jesus Christ is the Messiah. The overwhelming majority of Christians, though, and that's everybody from the Eastern Orthodox to the Roman Catholics to the Methodists, Baptists, Presbyterians, Anglicans, Pentecostals, Lutherans, and all that, we all observe Sunday, the Lord's Day, the weekly celebration of the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. We observe that as our Sabbath day, and I'll say more about that in a little bit. But for now, I just wanted to kick off this lesson by showing you that even when we think we know everything there is to know about one of the commandments, and we know exactly what it's requiring of us, more often than not, we just frankly don't. And so with that, let's pray. Again, using Martin Luther's great prayer for use before studying the Ten Commandments. Would you bow with me? O my God and Lord, help me by thy grace to learn and understand thy commandments more fully every day and to live by them in sincere confidence. Preserve my heart so that I shall never again become forgetful or ungrateful, that I may never seek after other gods or other consolation on earth or in any creature, but cling truly and solely to thee, my only God. Amen, dear Lord God and Father. Amen. Now then, let me ask you a question. Growing up, do you recall ever being prevented from doing anything on Sundays that you were allowed to do on the other 6 days of the week? Now, if you're under 30, maybe even under 40, my guess is that the answer is probably not. Because it's roughly in that generation, those two generations, that in the broadest, most general sense, observance of the fourth commandment was lost. And while I don't mean to indict entire generations of people unnecessarily, the empirical evidence, the statistical data, is on my side in this. For instance, when I was a child, there was very little that we were allowed to do, at least in the way of what you might call productivity. That is to say, labor, work. Of course, going to church was mandatory. Only heart attacks and severed limbs were valid reasons for not going to church. Nothing else was a legitimate excuse. In that pre-pandemic time, if you were sneezing, congested, aching all over, nauseated, coughing your head off, you were going to church. That's why God gave us Kleenex, cough drops, and Pepto-Bismol, my mama used to say. But when we got home from church, well, that was about it. We always ate Sunday dinner at my granny's house. Dinner, by the way, that she largely cooked the night before. She only did the barest of minimums when it came to cooking the rest of it on Sundays. And even that was done before she went to church. After lunch, we would get to play in the yard. We could play in the vast expanse of woods and in the pastures behind her house. We could ride our bikes. We might on occasion play stickball in the yard, or on more rare occasions, we might even get to go across the road to the river to fish or something like that. But that was about it, really. There was pretty much no work of any kind unless it was an extreme necessity. You couldn't do odd jobs around the house. You couldn't really tend to any livestock except for feeding them or giving them water. You couldn't chop wood, which we had to do back then. You couldn't work in the garden, and you definitely couldn't cut grass, which, for the record, is one thing to this day that grates my nerves and just crushes my spirit. And I think really separates the redeemed from the reprobates, heathens, pagans, and Philistines of the world. And that's the sound of a lawnmower on Sundays, which, to be honest, I hear a whole lot of in the neighborhood I live in now. Well, so I guess I should do some evangelizing. While I realize this may be a little on the pharisaical side and probably a tad on the hypocritical side as well, since I have church meetings on Sundays sometimes. Yet, while I realize there are probably bigger things to take issue with, it just seems to me that you could cut your grass on some other day rather than Sundays. Saturday, for instance, is a perfect day to mow your lawn or trim your hedges or blow the leaves out of your yard. Except that Saturday is the day so many people have to drive over to Clemson or down to Columbia for football games, which, for the record, in case you're wondering, have replaced church as the most important thing I must attend through the week. And as a result, everything else must be set aside, including grass cutting, because nothing can get in the way of my allegiance to football. See how that works? And I played football, so it's not sour grapes there. Now, at first, though, you probably thought I was just being snarky and picking on people who mow their lawns on Sundays. But in truth, I was actually setting up this little scenario to help you see what's at stake in keeping the Sabbath. Because keeping the Sabbath is not so much about what you do or don't do. Instead, it's about where your allegiance is. Although I still can't stand to hear the sound of a lawnmower on Sundays. And I do think that hearing one is also an indication of where one's allegiance lies. But back to the question about what you could or couldn't do on Sundays. My wife Faith, whose age I will refrain from saying for my own safety's sake, had a similar experience as I did growing up. She said that they could either play in the yard or they could take a nap. That was it. There was no going to the store, no going to visit relatives, no going anywhere except church on Sunday mornings and on Sunday evenings. For the record, that's when a lot of churches of all kinds of denominations still had Sunday evening services. But all that's changed now, of course. Today, Sundays are no different than any other day of the week, if we're honest. There's practically nothing you can't do on a Monday or a Thursday that you can't also do now on a Sunday. As I was thinking about this, I was reminded of a great old episode of the Andy Griffith Show. It's called, that episode was called Man in a Hurry. For the record, it's probably the most Christian and religious episode in the show's history. It's my opinion, but I think I'm hard-pressed to find anything more than that. The story begins with a businessman in the episode named Malcolm Tucker, who was on his way to Charlotte this particular Sunday morning for a meeting the next day. But his car breaks down just outside of Mayberry. So Mr. Tucker walks into town looking for somebody to work on his car. Now, before I go any further with the plot line, there's a telltale sign of where this is all going in a scene that shows Andy and Barney leaving church after Sunday worship, and Andy, Barney, and the preacher wish one another a good Sabbath. So there's the setup. It's the Sabbath day. It's Sunday, the Christian day of rest. At least there in Mayberry, there is nothing much else going on and nothing much going to be done. Except businessman Tucker doesn't know that yet. Sure, he knows it's Sunday, but the idea of Sabbath rest is something he's either forgotten or abandoned, which is why he is frantically searching for somebody to fix his car. But Wally, the owner of the filling station and the town mechanic, won't even look at it, let alone fix it. Why? Because it's Sunday. Now, the frustrated man ends up at the sheriff's house, where the slowed down pace of life only makes him more frustrated. Despite the fact now that Aunt Bee is putting the finishing touches on Sunday dinner and has invited him to eat with them, he's too flustered and too agitated to even do that. After lunch, Andy and Barney remind us once again that it's the Sabbath day as they sit down on the front porch and sing a verse of Little Brown Church in the Vale, one of my children's favorite hymns. Finally, businessman Tucker begins to soften as Andy and Barney sing, and he joins in singing part of the most reflective portion of the chorus that says, "No place is so dear to my childhood as the little brown church in the Vale." Ultimately, the show ends with the hard-shelled businessman, the man in a hurry, finally softening and slowing down. No doubt the writers of the show wanted us to believe that Mayberry got to him. But I like to think in this particularly Christian episode, I like to think that it was the Sabbath that got to him, and his recollection of being a boy wherever he grew up, and in that obviously Christian home of his that prioritized the Lord's Day, going to church, and Sabbath rest, which is why he was able to sing with such choked up emotion on that front porch, "No spot is so dear to my childhood as the little brown church in the Vale." Of course, I realize it's only a TV show from a bygone era, but I want to point out, maybe suggest two things. One, that though this episode first aired in 1963, 57 years ago, businessman Tucker really represents most people today in 2020. We're all men and women in a hurry, even on the Sabbath, I'm afraid. We've got to be somewhere. We've got to do something. We can't sit down. We can't slow down. We won't rest. Today, aside from the fact that church attendance is down everywhere and across the board, meaning that we just aren't going to church on Sunday mornings that much, we're instead mowing the lawn and blowing leaves and doing chores around the house. We bring our weekday work home with us to do at home on the weekends. If we get bored doing that, then there's practically anything else we can do. Every store is open of every kind. The two prominent exceptions that I can think of being Chick-fil-A and liquor stores. Chick-fil-A because they attempt to observe the Sabbath, and liquor stores because they're prevented by the state's blue laws, the remaining blue law, I guess, which I'll say more about in a bit, from opening on the Sabbath. And that brings me to my second point. We have robbed children of the Sabbath. They know practically nothing, zero, zilch, nil, nada, about the significance of this day the Lord Himself has set aside, and they know nothing because we either don't know it ourselves or, like Mr. Tucker, we've either forgotten it or long since abandoned it. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy, we read in Exodus 20, beginning with verse 8. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male servant, your female servant, your livestock, or the sojourner who is in your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Now then, let me go in a seemingly different direction to try to explain something. Despite those who try to argue to the contrary, it is a matter of inarguable fact that the first permanent non-native settlers in America were Christians. And as they began to lay the foundations for what would later become the United States, these early pilgrims established legal codes that regulated not only behavior, but also because they were Christians who strictly held to the Ten Commandments, they even regulated behavior on certain days of the week, which is to say, Sundays. And thus, without getting too technical, the first blue laws came to America. Again, for those of you under 40, blue laws are laws that are designed to restrict or ban some or even all Sunday activities, including shopping for, buying, or selling certain things. And these blue laws, sometimes in other places called Sunday laws, were enacted to promote the observance of Sunday as the day of worship and the day of rest. And don't get me wrong, Americans didn't invent blue laws. They just brought them here and sort of expanded on them because many nations around the world had them long before we did, and they still have them and still actively enforce them. Here in the good old USA, however, there's really there really aren't many blue laws in effect anymore, despite the fact that the Supreme Court ruled that blue laws were constitutional, and despite the fact that most of the labor unions, in fact, supported them. Most states left the decisions to keep or abandon them to the cities and the towns and the counties, who then, for the sake of profit, that is, for the sake of not losing money to the town or county next door, they repealed the blue laws within their jurisdiction for the most part. So economics here trumped religion. Mammon trumped the master. Filthy lucre trumped Almighty God. A little interesting trivia that I dug up studying for this. Here in Greenville, practically every business was closed 150, 200 years ago. The exceptions were hotels, restaurants, and drugstores. And even they were restricted regarding what they could sell. Now, when baseball, interestingly enough, was introduced in the 1870s, it presented a major problem for the blue laws in Greenville. First, because sporting events back then really weren't addressed in the blue laws. And it didn't prevent, therefore, teams from playing on Sundays. There was also the issue of having to pay in order to get in to a Sunday ball game. That also hadn't been addressed in blue laws. Added to the fact was the reality that when these baseball games caught on, pardon the pun, the crowds were just gigantic for the time, and they were very loud. Imagine 1870s, there's no other noise out there, so these crowds were very loud. To top it off, the Greenville News even wrote back then that many of the people who attended the games represented the lower class elements of Greenville County. So blue laws were amended across the county in the early 1910s to just ban baseball on Sundays. But that didn't last long. Baseball was still played, but you couldn't go there. Maybe I should say it that way. But again, I say it didn't last long because when the soldiers who were training for World War I at Camp Sevier, which was a temporary army installation on the southeast slope of Paris Mountain, when they came into town on Sundays for R&R in August of 1917 and couldn't buy soft drinks and couldn't go to movies and couldn't play pool or couldn't go to baseball games, things changed again. So once again, they changed the blue laws to allow the soldiers and everybody else really to go to ball games on Sundays, but only if they went for free, if they weren't charged admission. So for the next 20 years or so, Sunday ball games in Greenville were free. Maybe the Drive ought to try that. But this ultimately came back to bite Greenville, which had become, due to the Textile League, Greenville had become one of the major hubs of baseball in the country. In 1941, the Washington Senators, it was the major league team who owned the minor league Greenville Spinners. They gave up the franchise because they were losing money because they weren't able to charge for Sunday games. The very next year, when the Greenville Army Air Base opened at Donaldson Center to train for World War II, the county decided to change the blue laws again and abandon that prohibition, but it was too late because the Spinners had already left Greenville. Another strange example of blue laws in South Carolina having an odd effect. The state blue laws more recently were revised to allow sporting events on Sunday, but nevertheless, they did maintain that no event could start before 1 o'clock in the afternoon on Sundays to protect Sunday mornings when people should be in church. And if that sporting event was a race, for instance, a car race, then the race had to be 250 miles. How they came up with that, I don't know, but it couldn't be any more and it couldn't be any less, which meant that down in Darlington, because of rain that postponed a race on Saturday, the old NASCAR Rebel 500 in 2007, so that's only, 13 years ago, it had to be moved to Sunday. The green flag couldn't be dropped until 1 in the afternoon, and the 500-mile race had to be reduced to 250 miles. Now, I don't know who won. Honestly, don't really care, but that's neither here nor there. There's one bit of trivia left that I think you might find interesting. I've always wondered why an ice cream sundae is called an ice cream sundae. Well, now I know, and so will you. For some odd reason, hotels and restaurants and ice cream parlors, which all could be open, were still forbidden for selling soda water, which is simply carbonated water, even flavored carbonated water like Coke or something. They couldn't sell that stuff on Sundays. Why? I give up. I have no idea. Surely can't be a biblical reason. But anyway, so they were prevented. So some genius thought, hey, why don't we just leave out the soda water and mix in some syrup of some kind, chocolate or strawberry, and instead of calling it an ice cream soda, since we can't use that stuff on Sundays, why don't we call it an ice cream sundae? Then somebody came up with the cutesy way to spell Sunday to differentiate from the day of the week, and now you know the ice cream sundae is a direct result of the fourth commandment. See the kind of things you learn in my Bible studies? All of that aside, and as an aside, on the one hand, you can see that the blue laws had an economic effect on the places they were on the books, which were nearly everywhere. Some of them had good effects, some of them had bad effects, and this was, again, a practically universal phenomenon in the Christian world. But on the other hand, the prevailing mindset was that the blue laws were put in place to ensure that the Lord's Day, the Sabbath, indeed the God of the Sabbath, was honored. So to them, economics wasn't an issue to be considered one way or the other. Now then, this leads us to another issue. Some might argue that the blue laws were nothing but attempts to legislate morality, and that such a thing shouldn't be done by a government, especially a free government. You hear this all the time. We preachers get this a lot. Of course, before I go any further, I must add that it's somewhat true that we can't legislate morality in the sense that we can't make people moral by law, because if we can make people moral by law, it would be a simple matter for a town or a county council or a general assembly or Congress to pass some laws and make every American righteous. But it doesn't work that way, because people by nature are lawbreakers, which is to say we're sinners and we're predisposed to disobedience. We need a Savior to help us out of that. But still, in order to have a decent, orderly, civilized, peaceful, hopefully prosperous society, we must set boundaries on behavior so that we don't have lawlessness and chaos and the anarchy we're sadly seeing on the news every night right now. Certainly, there are those who continue to argue that you just can't legislate morality. But the problem with that line of thinking, of course, is that every law is legislation of one moral variety or another. Every law in the books is an example of legislated morality. Somebody's morality, good morality or bad morality. Because laws by nature, laws by design, are concerned with morality. This is right or this is wrong. That's the basic underpinning of the law. In other words, we legislate morality all the time. Murder someone? It's a crime. Lie under oath? It's a crime. Say something untrue about someone, which is slander, crime. Put that lie in writing, which is libel, crime. Steal something? It's a crime. Destroy someone's property? It's a crime. Break the speed limit? It's a crime. Lose your temper? Punch someone in the nose? Crime. Go fishing without a license? Crime. Shoot a deer out of season? Crime. And get drunk and drive a car or a boat or even walk down the street inebriated? You'll be in a heap of trouble if you do. Cheat on your husband and wife? There's even a legal and financial price to be paid for that. So yeah, we legislate morality all the time, whether we think about it or not. Here in America, as you probably picked up on from the list I just gave you, our laws are grounded in the Bible, in Judeo-Christian belief, in the Ten Commandments. Think about the ones I just mentioned. At least 8 in the list I just gave you are direct violations of the Ten Commandments. Number 6, number 7, number 8, and number 9. Commandments, number 6, 7, 8, and 9. And the blue laws were enacted to prevent violation of another commandment, the 4th one. They were put in place to protect the Sabbath from desecration. That is, whether people believed in God or not, it provided a safe haven for those who did believe to exercise their right to observe the Sabbath, to keep the Sabbath as they believe they should. For instance, say you were a non-Christian who owned a grocery store, restaurant, or department store, and say you had maybe 100 employees who were all Christians. You, of course, driven by economics, want to stay open every day in order to keep on making money. But your employees who aren't so driven by economics, they just want to observe the Sabbath on Sundays. Without the blue laws, that employer could force those employees to work, to violate the Sabbath by forcing them to come in and punch the clock. So blue laws really were some of the first workers' rights in the country. It's why the trade unions and the labor organizations all favored blue laws, as I mentioned earlier, I think. But now, since those laws have been repealed by county ordinances and city and town ordinances across the state, guess what? Almost everybody works on Sundays, and there's really no Sabbath left. So if that business owner wants to open his or her store, guess what? Those 100 people have to work or they lose their jobs. And this, by the way, really hits young people hardest. Because who do you think are working in restaurants, particularly drive-thrus, and who do you think are working at the grocery stores and department stores and malls and all these other places on Sundays? Teenagers and young people for the most part. Sure, it can be argued that if you must work on the real Sabbath, which many people now do, you can move the Sabbath to your day off. That's allowable. But let's be honest. Who actually does that? Do you know anybody who does? I don't. What we have today, in the years since the blue laws have mostly gone away, what we have now is at least 2 generations of people who have no idea what a true good Sabbath, as Andy and Barney called it, what a true day of rest, a true Lord's Day looks like, because everybody's working. Sunday is just as busy as the rest of the week. What have we lost because of this? Well, let's see. First, while there are a lot of other contributing factors involved in what I'm about to say, one of the primary casualties of Sunday work is the decline in church attendance. Congregations have gotten smaller because everybody's working on Sunday, especially the young people, as I just said. Another issue is youth sports. Since blue laws were abolished and church days were opened up for ball games, we've lost untold millions, yes, millions of children to sports leagues that play on Sunday mornings, Sunday evenings, afternoons, evenings, and on Wednesday nights, which means that not only has Sunday morning worship attendance declined, but that many churches, if not most, have abandoned Sunday evening worship altogether. And midweek prayer meetings, as we used to call them, which were regularly packed, gave way to much, much smaller midweek Bible studies or family night dinner and activity night. Today, it's nothing to hear the whir of lawnmowers and weed eaters and leaf blowers on Sunday. We go to restaurants and grocery stores and movies and the mall. Well, during the pandemic, not as much as maybe we used to, but we go to those places and we go to the gas station, to the sports stores, to the drug stores, and not only are our kids playing sports on Sundays, but sports arenas are packed. Again, I'm speaking in pre-pandemic terms here, but I expect it to fill right back up after the pandemic is over. From baseball to football to golf to NASCAR, if there's a big event to be watched and if we can find the tickets, we'll be there. All the while, either as a result or maybe as a contributing factor, churches are increasingly empty. And again, I'm speaking in pre-pandemic terms here. If the American church attendance graph were an EKG, they'd shock us with those paddles. If we were the stock market, they'd call it a crash. Because since the 1960s, the trajectory on a graph has been straight down. A recent nationwide survey indicated that, get this, less than 20% of Americans attend church on Sundays now. That is a little over 50 million people in church each week, which sounds like a big number, except there are 330 million people in the United States. Which not only confirms the fact that we're not remembering the Sabbath, and we certainly aren't keeping it holy, it also helps explain why things are the way they are in this country today. Sunday is no different than any other day, and God's people are really no different from any other people. And I wonder why we would even expect things to be different. But friends, let me just say this, whether it's because we weren't raised to go to church ourselves or because we are going to church, but maybe this commandment isn't taught anymore and we just don't know its importance, or because we don't read the Bible, or because we're working and maybe letting our kids work part-time jobs, or because we're taking them to play ball, we're actually raising children and grandchildren, to be honest, to not just not remember the Sabbath, we're actually teaching them to disregard the Sabbath. And that, my brothers and sisters, is really an indictment on parents, on grandparents, on churches, honestly, on all of us. So what can we do about it? Well, I think the answer is simply this. We need to get a better handle on this commandment. We need to get better acquainted with what the Sabbath is and why it's important. And then we just need to try to obey commandment number 4. So let's take a quick look in the time we have left. Theologians tell us there are a couple of questions that we need to ask ourselves regarding the Sabbath to help us better understand it. There's the linguistic question. What do the original words God spoke in this commandment actually mean? There's the historical question. Was there a Sabbath before the commandment was given on Mount Sinai? There's the big word dispensational question. When is the Sabbath to be kept? That is, what's the relationship between the Old Testament Sabbath and the New Testament Lord's Day, known as the Christian Sabbath? There is the ethical question. If the Lord's Day is the Christian Sabbath, what does it mean to keep it holy? And how do we do it? For the Christian, what is the command? And then number 5, there's the punitive question. Is there any danger involved if we don't keep the Sabbath? So to answer those questions, I want to look at a few different things, and I'm going to rely heavily on John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, the Anglican priest, who is responsible for all these churches with the Methodist label on them. So the first question, the linguistic question. What do the words of this commandment actually mean? Well, this one's easy enough, so let's take a minute to break the main words, not all of them, but just a couple of the main ones down. First, there's the word remember. We've actually talked about the word remember a couple of times already in this study, but just to refresh you, this kind of remember is not simply a mental recollection of information. Instead, it's an active kind of remembering, actively bringing the events of the past into the future in such a way that you're somehow reliving them, participating in them, and even benefiting from them. So what are we called to remember? 2 things, actually. Number 1, that God is our maker. In 6 days, the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that's in them, and rested on the 7th day, says Exodus 20:11. The second thing we're called to remember is that God is our Redeemer. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, Deuteronomy 5:15 says, and that the Lord your God brought you out of there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. Second major word, Sabbath. Literally, the Hebrew word Shabbat means to cease from work, to desist, to stop, to rest. Now, to be honest, you can't get much clearer than that. The Sabbath day is a day of rest. But what does it mean to rest? Well, theologically speaking, there are 3 primary understandings that must all be taken together when it comes to the word rest. There's the literal understanding. Rest means rest from labor, from work. We're called to rest, just as God himself rested after the work of creation. There's the spiritual understanding. Rest means rest in God and rest from sinning. If we're spending our Sundays focused on the Lord, remembering what he's done for us, then really sin can gain no entrance. The prophet Isaiah reminds us of this rest when he wrote in Isaiah 58, "If you keep the Sabbath day holy and don't pursue your own interests on that day, but enjoy the Sabbath and speak of it with delight as the Lord's holy day, and honor the Sabbath in everything you do on that day, and don't follow your own desires or talk idly, then the Lord will be your delight." Finally, there's another big word, the eschatological understanding of this word. Rest anticipates, it looks forward to the eternal rest the saved have in Jesus Christ. So then, Hebrews 4:9 assures us, there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. That is, there is a rest to come. Third word, keep. In Hebrew, this means to dedicate, to use, particularly use it for the purposes God gave it to you for. Which brings us to the fourth word, holy. We're supposed to keep this day holy. So what does that mean? Holy in Hebrew means set apart, different, to be beyond all comparison, to be utterly unique. It implies both a differentiation and a separation from everything else. especially the common, the mundane, the vulgar, the profane. So when God says to remember this day and keep it holy, we are to understand that the Sabbath is to be the day that we remember that God not only made us, but also in His love, that He also saved us. And we should ponder these realities, these truths all the time, but especially, particularly on the Sabbath, which is the day that should be kept totally different from every other day and should be marked as such. So how do we mark it then? Well, we mark it by resting. Not mindless, aimless rest, but God-centered resting, focusing yourself as you rest on God and His mighty acts of salvation on your behalf. And do it in a way that you don't do on other days, because this day is special. So mark it by resting from slavery to work, from resting from slavery to sin, resting in the Lord who set us free, and resting in the assurance that we will rest forever, free from every toil and snare, in heaven with the Lord one glorious day. Now, on to the second question, the historical question. Was there a Sabbath before this commandment was given? Now, most people, I expect, might be inclined to answer that question with a great big no, because Exodus 20 seems pretty clear. God gave this commandment to Moses on Mount Sinai the same day He gave us the other 9, or gave him the other 9. However, the Sabbath itself technically began at creation. There's this verse in Genesis 26:5 also that says, where God says, Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, kept my commandments and my statutes and my laws, which leads many people to believe that Abraham observed the Sabbath because it was already set down by God at creation. Now then, there's a lot of discussion and some disagreement in Bible scholar and theology land over the minutia of those two statements, but what we do agree on is that what God established on the seventh day of creation, something that definitely would have been known to Abraham, what God established at creation, He codified, made into a law on Mount Sinai, which is what led John Wesley to offer this word to both Anglicans and Methodists and anybody else who would listen. 6 days shalt thou do all manner of work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath day of the Lord thy God. It is not thine, it is God's day. He claims it for His own. He always did claim it for His own, even from the beginning of the world. In 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth and rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. Wesley says, He hallowed it, that is, He made it holy. He reserved it for His own service. He appointed that as long as the sun or the moon, the heavens and the earth should endure, the children of men should spend this day in worship of Him who gave them life and breath and all things. It was so from the beginning. It will be so to the end of the world. This He cannot give to another. O render unto God the things that are God, are God's, now, today, while it is called today. Question 3, the dispensational question. Is the Sabbath Saturday or Sunday? I think I've already answered this question earlier in the study. Pardon me for scratching my head, but there is some sort of flying critter in here. It's landed on my knee a couple of times, and then it just landed on the back of my head. Anyway, question 3, the dispensational question. Is the Sabbath on Saturday or Sunday? Again, I think I've already answered this question earlier in the study. The original Sabbath, according to Genesis, was the seventh day of the week, and that's Saturday. It's why Jews to this day continue to observe a Saturday Sabbath. For Christians, however, the holiest day of the week, the day we should rest in God's goodness to us, the Sabbath for us, was transferred to the first day of the week, Sunday, because Jesus Christ, God incarnate, the second person of the Holy Trinity, rose from the dead on Sunday, which makes every Sunday not only the Sabbath for us, but also the weekly celebration of the resurrection. It's why we Christians are known as Easter people, not just because of the holiday in the spring, but also because we're supposed to celebrate that event every Sunday we gather for worship. Incidentally, because the early church, according to the New Testament, celebrated the Lord's Supper when they gathered for worship on the Lord's Day, I, along with a whole lot of other people, I think a very strong case can be made for having communion every Sunday when we gather. That's what they did. Question 4, the ethical question. How do we keep the Sabbath holy? What are we supposed to do? 17th century Puritan Richard Baxter wrote this prescription for how to keep the Sabbath holy. Now listen to this. Rise early on Sunday morning and pray in private. Have family devotions. Go to church. And do not sleep in church, he wrote. After returning home and while the noon meal is being prepared, pray in private and review everything that was said in church. Enjoy a festive meal with conversation about the love of our Redeemer or something fitting for Sunday. After the meal, gather the family for a psalm or for singing and instruction, such as the catechism. Later in the day, go to church once more. Come home and gather the family to call upon God in prayer and song and to rehearse the sermon. Thereafter, eat, but not too much. After the meal, question the children about what they had learned during the day. Sing a song, conclude with prayer, and end the day with holy thoughts. Now, I admit that's a lot. And it's pretty strict, pretty rigid, but then again, they didn't call them Puritans for nothing, did they? Of course, we modern types flinch at such a list, but I have to say that the Reverend Baxter was on the right track, because Sunday, the Sabbath, is all about God, or at least it should be. Sure, the Lord made it for us to rest, but remember, as Augustine said, our external rest ought to do nothing other than signify the internal rest of our souls in Jesus Christ, who said, "Come unto me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." John Wesley agreed and said, "For whose sake does God lay claim to this day? For his sake or for thine? Doubtless not for his own. He needeth not thee, nor any child of man. For thy own sake, therefore, God thy Maker doeth this. For thy own sake he calleth thee to serve him. For thy own sake he demands a part of thy time to be restored to him that gave thee all. Acknowledge his love on the Sabbath. Learn while thou art on earth. Learn to praise the King of heaven. Spend the Sabbath day as thou hopest to spend that day which never shall have an end in heaven." Wesley goes on to say, "On the Sabbath day, above all, cry aloud to the God who heareth prayer. This is the day he hath set apart for the good of your soul, both in this world and that which is to come. Never more disappoint the design of his love, either by worldly business or idle diversions. Let not a little thing keep you from the house of God, even in the forenoon or the afternoon." Again, this business of going to church twice on Sundays. "And spend as much as you can for the rest of the day, either in repeating what you have heard," sounds like Baxter, "or in reading the scripture, or in private prayer, or in talking of things about God, the things of God. Let his love be ever before your eyes. Let his praise be ever in your mouth. You have lived many years in folly and sin. Now, simply live one day unto the Lord." So, Wesley shoots straight, doesn't he? He is largely in agreement here with his Puritan forerunner, Richard Baxter, and fully in agreement with Augustine in saying that we keep the Sabbath holy by resting in the Lord, by focusing on him, by giving our time and our attention to him, by praying, by praising him, by reading the Bible, by acknowledging his love, by going to church, not missing church, by worshiping him in church. By the way, by going to church when the church doors are open, not choosing whether you will go if the doors are open or not, or choosing between which time you'll go or what have you, but go when the doors are open, morning and evening, 2 services, remember, and letting nothing keep you from church. Wesley says, by having good, godly, wholesome conversations, especially conversations about God with our children and families, about what God has done for us, by avoiding sin, by not disappointing God, by doing worldly business or enjoying idle conversations that are pointless, by generally resting in God's love and in the hope of eternal rest in Him, and spending the day with the Lord who gave you life, who redeemed your life, and who promises you everlasting life. Now then, we come to the last question, question 5, the punitive question. So, what's the big deal? Is there any danger in not keeping the Sabbath? Let me end this study this way. Without any further or additional comment, I simply want to read you Wesley's answer to that question. Some words John Wesley wrote. He addressed them simply to a Sabbath breaker. Remember the question. Is there any danger in not keeping the Sabbath? Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Have you forgotten who spoke these words? Or do you set him at defiance? Do you bid him do his worst? Have you a care? You are not stronger than he. Let the potsherds strive with the potsherds of the earth. But woe unto the man that contendeth with his Maker. He sitteth on the circle of the heavens, and the inhabitants of the earth are as grasshoppers before him. Shall a man then rob God, and art thou the man? Consider, think what thou art doing. Is it not God who giveth thee all thou hast? Every day thou livest, is it not a gift from Him? And wilt thou give Him none? Nay, wilt thou deny Him what is His own already? He will not, He cannot quit His claim. Do not ask any more, where is the harm if after church I spend the remainder of the day in the fields or in a public house, a pub, or in taking a little diversion. You know where is the harm. Your own heart tells you so plain that you cannot but hear. It is a base misspending of your talent and a barefaced contempt of God and His authority. You have heard God's judgments, even upon earth, against the profaners of His day. And yet these are but as drops of that storm of fiery indignation which will at last consume His adversaries. Glory be to God, who hath now given you a sense of this. You now know this was always designed for a day of blessing. May you never again, by your idleness or profaneness, turn that blessing into a curse. What folly, what madness would that be? And in what sorrow and anguish would it end? For yet a little while, and death will close up the day of grace and mercy. And those who despise them now will have no more Sabbaths or sacraments or prayers forever. Then how will they ever wish to recover that which they now so idly cast away? But all in vain, for they will then find no place for repentance, though they should seek it carefully with tears. Oh, my friend, know the privilege you enjoy. Now remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Your day of life and of grace is far spent. The night of death is at hand. Make haste to use the time you have. Improve the last hours of your day. Now provide the things which make for your peace, that you may stand before the face of God forever. Whoever has ears, let them hear. I'll see you next time.